Now we go into muscles of the body. Remember, the muscle system is going to be responsible for movement. We have different types. We have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle are the three types of muscle. All of this chapter we're going to be talking about skeletal muscle. Regardless of whether it's skeletal, smooth, or cardiac, when we talk about muscles, we're going to be talking about movement. Things moving around the body, and that can be like blood and circulation. And that happens through movement of the heart muscle, when the heart ends up having a beat and contracts. Movement of ingestia. So ingestas move through propulsion by movement of smooth muscle inside of the intestines. Excretion of glands. So this could be salivary glands or mammary glands, sweat glands, and this happens through contraction of smooth muscle that forces contents of the glands out. Locomotion of the body. So locomotion of the body is the actual movement of the body physically from one location to another by the skeletal muscle there. Changes in things like diameter of blood vessels and of bronchi. So either dilating them or potentially constricting them. And then actions like micturition, which is urination, and parturition, which is the act of giving birth. So muscle is one of the four types of body tissues and basic cell types of the body. The other ones being things like epithelial, connective tissue, and then nervous tissue. Excitability, contractibility, extensibility, and elasticity are the main characteristics of all muscles. So with excitability, they have the ability to respond to input from a nerve impulse or from another muscle contracting next to them. Contractibility, they have the ability to actually shorten their length. Extensibility, when pulled on, they have the ability to stretch. And then elasticity, they return to their original shape after either contraction or extension. Three things that muscles end up doing is, number one is providing that motion or that movement that we were talking about. They're able to actually perform locomotion and actually move the body. They're able to move ingesta through contraction and peristalsis. They're able to move blood through the contraction of the heart. They maintain posture, and so that can be actually the physical posture of the body when they're standing, or like us when we're sitting, but it also can be posture of organs. And then lastly, they can generate heat. So they're very important for maintaining body temperature of mammals and of avian. Types of muscle, we have skeletal muscle. It's going to be voluntary and striated. Voluntary meaning it's underneath your conscious control, and you can determine when that muscle is moved and when it's not moved. And so the main thing the skeletal muscle does is provides locomotion of the organism through movement of the skeleton. And it's going to be found in the musculoskeletal system. Cardiac muscle is involuntary, meaning you cannot consciously control it. And it's also going to be striated. And it's only going to be found in the heart. It's not going to be found in any blood vessels or any nearby tissue like the lungs. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. Lastly, we have smooth muscle. It is involuntary and it is non-striated. So when we look underneath the microscope, we see no striations with it. It carries out both unconscious movements of the body, and a lot of your internal movements of the body are going to be controlled through smooth muscle. So it's going to be in charge of things like controlling the diameter of blood vessels or bronchi, of moving the intestinal tract, like causing parturition to occur when the uterus contracts through through smooth muscle, closing the iris or dilating the iris of the eye, so where your pupil is at, or controlling the lens in the eye. This is all through smooth muscle. So skeletal muscle, really quick, we're going to look at the overall gross anatomy, some of the microscopic anatomy and physiology of skeletal muscle there. So skeletal muscle does the following things. It's important for maintaining balance. This can be underneath conscious control. Usually this is under an unconscious control, so you don't really think about your balance. But if you do go to trip as you're walking, you can quickly grab onto something and regain and control your balance again. Posture, once again, this is something that's generally more unconscious, but you can have conscious control over. You can actually sit there and change the way that you're sitting in your seat or the way that you're standing, and animals can do the same thing. Respirations are generally underneath unconscious control. We do it without thinking. However, we can control it. We can slow down our breathing or speed it up. Locomotion is almost always underneath conscious control, meaning you're thinking about it when you're moving from one location to another about what you're doing. But there might be some movements that end up being under unconscious control, such as reflexes, or we can also have things like muscle spasms that can cause unconscious control of muscles. Lastly, skeletal muscle we can always see is striated, and even underneath some of the lowest magnification, like 4 to 10 power of the microscopes underneath the ejectus there, you can actually see the striation. So here's a cross section of muscle, and we're going to actually start off at the smallest unit right here. And this is going to be the muscle cell, also known as a muscle fiber. So there's just one of these right here. We end up actually bundling all of these muscle cells together. Say in this example right here, we have like 10 of them. And then we actually put a protective sheath around them. And when we group them all together and put a protective sheath around them, that is what is known as a fascicle. And so that's what we're showing right here is this fascicle is 10 or more of these muscle cells put together with a outer covering. And that outer covering around this group of muscle cells and this fascicle is going to be something known as endomysium. So endomysium ends up being a fascicle and the connective tissue around it. That connective tissue is going to be dense regular connective tissue. So this is all dense regular connective tissue around them. Inside the muscle itself, we're going to have perhaps up to hundreds of these fascicles. And so joining them all together, all these fascicles that make up a muscle, you're going to have something called perimysium. And so this actually holds the fascicles and the endomysiums together. Lastly, what we physically see on the outside as a muscle is actually the outer muscle fascia, which ends up being what's known as epimysium. So epimysium is this outer fascia that surrounds that whole muscle. All of this epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium eventually is going to taper off at the end and is actually going to turn into a tendon, which is what we have here is a tendon. And so all of these perimysiums and endomysiums and then the outer covering of the epimysium are actually going to terminate into this tendon, which is then going to insert onto a bone. And when this tendon contracts, we're going to have a movement. We do have areas of the body, such as in the abdomen here, where muscles don't end in bones, but they can end in other muscles. And then in that case, they make something called an aponeurosis. And so an aponeurosis is an area of dense regular connective tissue where a bunch of muscles terminate into it. And the main one we know of in the body is something called the linea alba, which is right here on the ventral midline of the abdomen. So it's underneath there where the belly's at. There's no bones, but all the abdominal muscles will actually terminate right here. And where they do, they end up having this thick band of dense regular connective tissue that's really, really tough that holds everything together. When we look at muscles, we have what we call origins and we have insertions. So an origin is where the muscle is going to originate from, and this is a much more stable site for the muscle. And when the muscle contracts, there's actually no movement at the area of the origin. Instead, the bone is going to be moved at the insertion. And so at the insertion, this is going to be a location where that tendon is going to go to in the bone. And when the muscle contracts, the bone is going to be moved either in a movement for flexion or extension. And this is from contraction of the muscle and force placed on the area of the insertion. When we look at muscle movements, we have 4 different types of muscle actions and what role the muscles themselves will play. So we have the prime mover, otherwise known as the agonist. This is the muscle that produces the desired movement. So an example of this would be your biceps brachii muscle. When it contracts, your elbow is actually going to sit there and flex. An antagonist is a muscle that does the exact opposite action of the agonist. So for every agonist and prime mover that we have in our skeletal system, there's always an antagonist. And so the antagonist always moves in the opposite direction. The unique feature of skeletal muscle is it does this. You actually have a muscle that moves something in one direction, say maybe flexes, and another muscle that extends. And so the antagonist to the biceps brachii is going to be the triceps muscle. A synergist is a muscle that ends up doing the same type of contraction, causing the same type of movement in the same direction as the prime mover. An example of a synergist for the biceps brachii muscle would be the brachialis muscle, which also causes, when it contracts, flexion of the elbow. Lastly, we have fixator muscles, and these help to stabilize joints whenever the prime mover is contracting. And so these actually have nothing to do with the actual movement within the plane of either flexion or extension, but instead they help to stabilize the joint during that movement. So an example of this would be something like your extensor carpi radialis or flexor carpi radialis that would attach at the elbow joint and would actually end up moving more of your wrist in your digits, but they end up being a fixator there at the elbow, helping to stabilize the joint for the movement of the biceps brachii. Lastly, we get into muscle naming conventions, and we can name muscles over 6 different things, and it can be individually for one of these 6 things or a combination of them. So we can look at actions of the muscle. So what type of action is it doing? So in the first example here, we have superficial digital flexor, and the action is the flexing, and so the superficial digital flexor muscle ends up flexing the joint. We can name them over shape. So we have the deltoid muscle, and so it is triangular in shape like a delta, and so we call that muscle the deltoid. It can be over location or a region in the body. So the biceps brachii. Biceps brachii ends up being in the area of the brachium, or where the humerus is in the upper arm. So brachii is a location. Direction of muscle fibers can also be used in naming. So the rectus abdominis, when we look at rectus, it means to run in a straight line. So the rectus abdominis ends up being the muscle that people know as their six packs. We can name them for the number of heads or divisions in the muscle. So biceps brachii, triceps brachii, quadriceps brachii. All of these are the number of heads. Bi being for 2 heads, 3 for 3 heads, quad for 4 heads. And then actually last we can look at things like origin and insertion. So the sternocephalicus actually has its origin at the manubrium of the sternum, and cephalicus, it goes up to the cervical vertebrae, and hence how it gets its name sternocephalicus. We can do things like superficial digital flexor. We can have naming for both a location and a function. So digital would be location, flexor would be function. Or biceps brachii, we can actually sit there and name them for the number of heads plus the regional areas. So it's very common to have 2 of these actually used together when we're naming a muscle for, say, like action and location, or location and the number of heads. But we can also just have like the deltoid, where we're just using one of these, in that case just describing its shape. So that's an introduction to muscles and the basic muscle anatomy and physiology. Next, we're going to look at selected skeletal muscles.